There's an intense battle underway at that steel plant that Russian forces have had under siege for weeks in Mariupol on the port, that big port city on the Black Sea in Ukraine. This as we're learning new details about the role that U.S. intelligence played in the sinking of the Moskva, the biggest warship in Russia's Black Sea fleet. Joining us now is ABC News' Marcus Moore with the latest from Kyiv, and ABC News national security and defense analyst and former Assistant Secretary of State of Defense, for the Middle East, Mick Mulroy, our usual gang here. So, Marcus, let me begin with you. What's the latest we know on what I'm thinking of as the Ukrainian Alamo, that steel plant where those fighters have been in there for weeks under bombardment, under siege? What do we know?
Well, Terry, as you have described this in the past, this is a real David versus Goliath situation or scenario that's been unfolding in Mariupol. And we know that at the Azovstal steel plant, which has been known as the last holdout for Ukrainians in that city, there has been intense fighting there. But despite claims by the Russians that they have control of that plant, the Ukrainians say that they are still fighting there and they have not laid down their arms and that they won't lay down their arms. And in the midst of the intense fighting that we have seen in that part of the country, there are hundreds of civilians who, we are told, have been taking refuge in the underground tunnels as well as the bunkers there. And there have been efforts to evacuate those civilians. We know that this week that at least 300, mostly women and children, were evacuated from the Azovstal steel plant, as well as other parts of Mariupol and the southeastern part of Ukraine. But it does give you a sense of the urgent and very dangerous effort to evacuate people there. The UN, in conjunction with Ukraine and Russia, have negotiated the ceasefire to allow humanitarian corridors to evacuate some of the civilians. But those corridors have only been short-lived, if you will, because shortly after some of the evacuations, the heavy shelling has continued. Russia, as you know, Terry, wants control of Mariupol and the eastern part of Ukraine, and they have been trying very hard to gain that control. But Ukraine saying they are still in the fight. And as that fight has continued, we have seen really an intense bombardment from the Russians there, and that continues even today. Even though the Russian Defense Ministry says that as many as 50 civilians were evacuated today, that's according to the Russians, but the Ukrainians say that in the midst of an evacuation that was underway, that one of the vehicles came under fire. And that there were casualties there. And so, Terry, you know that there's a lot of conflicting information about what's happening, but there has been a real effort to get the civilians, again, women and children, to safety from there, but in the midst of very intense fighting because both Ukraine and Russia want control of Mariupol.
Absolutely, Marcus. Thanks. Mick, I want to go to you on this report that U.S. officials are telling reporters on background that America provided intelligence to Ukrainians that allowed them to sink that ship, the Moskva, one of the biggest successes of the war for Ukraine. So two questions. How big, how significant is that? What does it tell you about the kind of intelligence? And what does it tell you that it's being disclosed, that the United States is willing to have Russia know that we helped headhunt the flagship of their Black Sea fleet?
Yeah, Terry. So I would start with, it's certainly understandable why the administration would want to tout all the things that we are doing to help our Ukrainian partners. I would argue, perhaps my background as a CIA officer, that they should not include intel sharing. Not because it's not important, it is critical. But because it is critical, any disclosure could potentially damage our ability to collect that information. To the second part of your question, it is perhaps wanting to send a message to Russia that we are actively in this and having a substantial effect. I'd also say that when it comes to the ship, it is a lawful military target. It was the flagship. Russia has threatened to launch an amphibious assault. It's obviously in the chain of command, and it is a lawful target. And to these generals, generally speaking, tactical intelligence tells you where an enemy is or is going to be and their intention. Part of that's going to be where the C2, the command and control element is. That is obviously a valid military target, and Usually, the command and control is where the general officers are located. So it's not an assassination. They are combatants on a battlefield of their choice. They are lawful military targets. So there's no legality here. The only issue I can see is whether it could potentially escalate tensions with Russia.
Well, let me quickly follow up on that, because there's one thing to help the Ukrainians, and the Russians might have expected that we do. There's nothing to brag about it to the whole world. I mean, does it escalate? I mean, it doesn't increase the risk that Russia would hit NATO territory or even a U.S. target.
So that's what I'm most concerned about. That and the fact that we might have, in a way, damaged our means of collecting this. So sources and methods you'll hear a lot. I don't know if that's true, but certainly not talking about it would reduce the chances of exposure. And then to your question, which I think is very valid, why brag about it? Essentially, walk softly and carry a big stick. In this case, do everything we can to help the Ukrainians win, but try to avoid having to talk about it so much because, quite frankly, that promotes the idea that this is a conflict really between Russia and the U.S. And not the U.S. assisting a key partner in Ukraine try to defend itself against this invasion.
Absolutely. Mick, Marcus, thanks very much once again on Ukraine.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.